I'm being joined by James Corbett of the CorbettReport.com. Thank you for joining me.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you. I'd like to start off by talking about Egypt. What are your thoughts of Al-Baradei? He just kind of came out of nowhere.
That's right, yeah. Al-Baradei was, he didn't exactly come out of nowhere. I mean, he's obviously been on the international scene for quite a while, but it certainly was, from an Egyptian perspective, he did seem to come out of nowhere. He's been sort of more of an international figure for quite a while, and involved with UN weapons inspections and that kind of thing. And yes, from an Egyptian perspective, I think he hasn't been involved in the politics of Egypt, and to suddenly appear as this presidential candidate was suspicious, especially given his ties to numerous globalist institutions and organizations and backers. So that was quite suspicious, and I think maybe it exposed the agenda a little bit regarding what was really happening in the Egyptian situation, because although the narrative is that this was just a spontaneous people's uprising, of course the overall picture seems to be painted in quite a different direction, and it's just another example of Western interventionism being obscured in corporate-controlled and establishment media that refuses to report on those things that are problematic to the official narrative. And that continues to play out even today, because, of course, there was an intense amount of media coverage of the Egyptian uprisings as they were happening. But now, suddenly, of course, the interest has shifted, and no one's covering what's happening in Egypt anymore. And that's because, of course, now that the elections are shaping up, it looks like the Muslim Brotherhood is going to be playing a big role in this. So this idea that this was all for liberation and democracy, so, isn't exactly playing out the way it was painted. And I think they run the risk of exposing that fact if they actually continue covering the subject, which is why we don't hear about it anymore.
Well, the reason why I bring up Al-Baradei is he seemed to just did he not just arrive in Egypt not long before the revolution began? I
believe that's correct. Yes, very shortly before, basically saying that that Egypt needed a revolution, needed to get rid of Mubarak, and then suddenly it was provided. So it did seem that it was being paved, the path was being paved for him.
Well, I want to get your thoughts on something Henry Kissinger said in an interview with Bloomberg. Well, like he of course he said this is the first act of the first scene is about to be played out. But there's another comment in that interview that I don't think has gotten enough play. He basically said something to said something to the effect of basically, well, I know I know Al-Baradei. He just kind of seems like this guy that comes in the beginning of a revolution and just, is a transitionary figure and then just disappears at the end of it. Isn't that a strange remark? It's like, yeah, like we all know that guy who just goes at the beginning of a revolution, was a transitionary figure and disappears. Like, tell me you haven't been out drinking 100 times with that guy.
Yeah, suspicious, isn't it? No, that is an interesting remark, isn't it? Really, what kind of historical personages are we talking about with those kind of guys? And clearly, if there are those kinds of people that are operating in revolutions, they're the type of people who are sent in there to foment things by the people who are really fomenting the revolutions, isn't it? I mean, it's people who come in and stir things up. So you might think about historical revolutions and how they've played out, and how they always seem to play out in the hands of the people who want to centralize power more in the hands of fewer people. And even in the revolutions that are done in the name of democracy or whatever, I mean, you look at the French Revolution and the way that played out, and you had Robespierre taking over in the Reign of Terror and starting to, chop people's heads off by the hundreds or thousands, and doing it in the name of democracy, saying it was tyranny was the liberation of democracy, or whatever ridiculous quotes he was using to try to justify it. And it happens time and again throughout history that no matter what ideals are used in these types of revolutions, the revolutionary fervor can be stirred up and the masses can get behind these horrible, bloody events. And unfortunately, that power, that energy can often be redirected back against the people who even started the revolution in the first place. And people who are wise to history and know that fact can manipulate that fact for their own ends, and can use revolutions to really change and reorder societies, which is what we are seeing very, very definitely, I have no doubt, in this Arab Spring and in the color revolutions that preceded it.
Indeed. It is kind of funny because my last time I checked, the military was taken over in Egypt, which doesn't seem very democratic to me.
No, in fact, in many ways, there's really been no transition whatsoever, except for Mubarak and his intelligence chief. I forget his name escapes me at the moment, but he was CIA or trained in the U.S. I forget his name, but he was the one who took over after Mubarak, and he was forced to step down because the Egyptians knew he was just another front for the Mubarak regime. But yes, I mean, the entire time it's been a military dictatorship in Egypt, and it continues to be a military dictatorship. And now they're giving lip service to elections, and we'll see what takes place. But even if that happens, it's very likely that the Muslim Brotherhood will make significant gains in the country, and it will turn more into an Islamic regime, which supposedly, ostensibly, in the whole war on terror narrative is, of course, what the Americans are fighting against. But really, in a more subtle Hegelian dialectic kind of way, obviously, the Americans have always been arming and propping up their enemies in order to give them an excuse, a justification for moving into a region and setting up a power base. And that's what's happened time and again throughout history, and it works very well because the people can be led along to hate the bearded turban men or whatever the enemy of the weak is, and just blindly go along with any kind of military intervention. And of course, what we see playing out in the region is very much a resource war that's going on, I think, on a level between America and China and Russia, which is forming a bloc with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And we've been seeing this develop throughout the 1990s, certainly in North Africa. China was definitely moving in and making some big moves and making some strategic deals with Egypt and with Libya and with the other countries that we see in the crosshairs in this uprising. So it's definitely strategic interests at play here, and it's been noted time and again throughout this decade. There have been mainstream stories in BBC and other outlets about AFRICOM and trying to set up this American interventionist military force in the region, but somehow they never connect those pieces together. They never talk about that in relation to what's happening with the Arab Spring.
No, I agree with you 100%. I'd like to ask you, what do you make of Mubarak's mysterious removal from power? First, he said he was going to stay until September, and then the next day his vice president goes on TV and says that he's resigned, and then not long after that, said he has this mysterious stroke. Kind of seems strange to me.
Yeah, very strange indeed. Well, we see a lot of that type of thing playing out in these situations, and we've seen that also with Gaddafi. I think, wasn't it originally they were reporting that he had gone to Venezuela and all of these ridiculous things that turned out not to be true. And I think a lot of these stories are just planted in the media in an attempt to derail the regime, to try to sow confusion, to try to demoralize supporters of this or that government. So I think there's a lot of black propaganda, which is what it's called by the CIA, that's sowed in these types of events. So it's an admitted thing that the CIA has done in the past, is sown these fake stories in the media that are supposedly meant for foreign audiences, that never meant for American audiences, because the CIA doesn't operate in America, of course. But they admit to sowing these stories, and they call it black propaganda. It's meant to sow confusion and disorient the enemy. And we see these types of stories that have no basis in reality that pop up at times like this, and you have to wonder, where are these stories coming from? Who are the sources? How are they getting disseminated so widely and so quickly?
What do you think the real pretext for going into Libya was? Because we've heard, of course, the humanitarian excuse, but I don't think with the love bombs, the bombs of love that are dropping down. Do you think how much of a factor did Gaddafi's plan to institute a gold-backed currency play into this? Do you think? Because it obviously would be, in my opinion, would be a huge threat to the global hegemony, of the financial hegemony of the Federal Reserve.
Yes, well, we often see that people who are going against the hegemony of the petrodollar tend to find themselves in the crosshairs of the American interventionist forces and the NATO and all of that. So I don't know specifically in great detail about the plans to institute a gold-backed currency. I wasn't really following that, but certainly I do know that Libya had a sort of independent economic system. It didn't have a central bank that operated in the way that the Federal Reserve, for example, does, creating debt-based money, using fractional reserve banking and that sort of thing. So once again, it's very interesting how the axis of evil always seems to be the economies and countries that aren't playing ball with the international system. And that doesn't mean that I'm a supporter of Gaddafi or of Mahmoudinejad or any other of these regimes. It's just that they're trying to play us into this dialectic, this dichotomy, this false dichotomy between this is good, this is bad, therefore let's go after the bad. So I think that was one of the significant factors, the economic factors. There's the resource factors, again, of course, oil being one of Libya's main exports, and it was interesting for me to see that one of the first places that these so-called spontaneous uprising of the rebels attacked was a Chinese oil company in the region, and forced the Chinese workers there to go back to China. Very interesting development. I'm not sure why these democracy-seeking Gaddafi haters really targeted Chinese oil companies so much, but that was just an interesting part that revealed a bit more of the agenda. And also, Gaddafi was working on other projects to try to make Libya more of a first world type country, and he was working on projects to bring water into the country and things like that to really start to modernize it and bring it up to a higher standard. And as we know, people in third world countries who truly do try to socialize the wealth, whatever you might think of socialism as an ideology, at least when people actually honestly try to implement it, they inevitably end up getting demonized and ultimately bombed or killed. And we saw that in Iran with Operation Ajax taking down Mossadegh when he was trying to nationalize the oil companies, and we saw that in Latin America time and time again throughout the 60s and 70s. In Chile and places like that. So absolutely, I think there are a lot of different strategic reasons for this. Another one was that Gaddafi was going off in recent months and years talking about China was going to be the dominant player in North Africa because they let nations basically determine their own fate, whereas the Americans wanted to intervene. So I think he was starting to form a closer relationship with China, and again, that's part of the overall geopolitical wrangling that's going on in the region. So a number of converging interests, I think, are at play here, but I think humanitarian intervention and the responsibility to protect is just a convenient excuse that has been invented in recent years. And we also see that playing out elsewhere in Africa. We saw that with the creation of South Sudan last week, the newest country on the planet, which was supposedly brought about by the conflict in Sudan and the Darfur region, which of course was quite heavily touted in the media for a number of years there, talking about the genocide or alleged genocide of the Arab government in the north against the mostly black Christian animist population in the south. And so we have this creation of South Sudan, but there's a lot more behind that story than what we're being told. And again, there's a history and a pattern of Western intervention in the region. Again, it's largely due to resources and things that are going on there, from oil deposits to gum arabic and the interests of Coca-Cola and Pepsi, for example. I mean, the major source of gum arabic in the world comes from Sudan, which is now in South Sudan, which is going to be quite friendly to Western governments, more so than the Arab regime in Khartoum. So again, we see this as a pattern time and time again throughout the region and throughout the world, really. And unfortunately, because we're not being shown how these puzzle pieces connect together in the corporate-controlled media, we're at a loss. We're being put into a system of ignorance and dangled pieces of pop culture and things as if that's really the news that we should be watching. And that's a system by which obviously the elite oligarchs and the power players who are manipulating the system can keep us basically enslaved and enjoying our own enslavement.